Welcome everyone to the climate of emotions. This is a retreat where we're diving into emotions, climate change, and social justice. And today's panel is part of a series of events occurring over the next 3 days, including an intimate small group and experiential session. Today's theme is newly emerging, about honoring the pain of where we are today and also preparing ourselves for the next steps into a new space for solutions. I'd like to start off by welcoming Jennifer Uchendu to make opening remarks. Jennifer is a change maker and activist in Nigeria, empowering young people to make a difference. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you very much, Isaac. A very huge privilege to be here today. In this space we've all created to talk about something very important, something very critical, something we can all relate to, the times that we're in, double issues with COVID-19, climate change, so much happening at the same time, so many triggers and so many conversations. I'm glad to be in this space and to have this conversation with everyone, particularly, and every time I like to, bring up myself and that positionality, being a young African woman, climate activist, very, very interested in wanting to see change, but at every point in time struggling with what the reality is on ground, is the fact that there's a whole system out there constantly in opposition with this ideal world we want to create. And events like this then give us the platform to be optimistic, but then also to have that balanced optimism where can we think, or can we reimagine a new world? What does that look like, and what do we need to do? What are the steps of restoration and stopping to pause and reimagine that we need to do? And for me, I mean, I've been through the motions, coming from that heavily overwhelmed phase of eco anxiety, being so overwhelmed, angry, and outraged at the current state of our world, and then to now sort of finding space with activists and friends and colleagues who see things in the same light. And that's what this panel does. That's what spaces like this does. It helps me to be with like minds, people who also see the problem and see the enormosity of the problem of climate change, the problem of the world systems and how they're constantly in opposition with young people, the problem of injustice, be it racial, climate, or just marginalization that goes across board. And what this platform for me does is then helps us to think through ideas, and then it gives that sense of solidarity, which is something that I like to even expand more on. What really is solidarity in this new world? So solidarity for me is all of us coming together hand in hand, thinking through such insurmountable problem, admitting where we are, that though we are small, though we are not as powerful, but in our own context and in our own space, we can work together hand in hand to move forward and to press forward. And part of what our discussion today in this panel would be, in terms of reimagining a new world, we're all putting in our positionality, we're all putting in our context and saying, where do I stand in the mindset of this big problem? Where do I stand? How badly am I affected? And what can we do? For young people like ourselves, for people who look like me, for people who feel like they're more powerful and they can support more, what can we do and how can we reimagine this world? And I guess a good way to start from it's how I even started this journey of change making back in Nigeria. I believe I was about 22 or 21, where I realized that there was an opportunity for young people to actively be involved in climate, but there was always that opposition from adults saying you don't have the experience, you don't have the platform, who supports you, where do you have who's your support system, basically. And then I started a blog called SustyVibes, and at that time, what SustyVibes was doing was to sort of write about climate change and sustainability issues in Nigeria from a young person's point of view. And what we then saw grow was a lot of people reading this blog, a lot of people wanting to do something, a lot of people saying, let's meet up somewhere, we can take up action. And that is what that virtual space birthed. And now SustyVibes is 5 years old, grown to this really large organization with several volunteers working in different parts of Nigeria, on sustainability projects within community. What does that mean? It means that that virtual space of our blog, as small as it seemed, as simple as it is, because it was a WordPress blog, as simple as it is, it was able to sort of bring change, as it were. It then gave us a platform to push through as young people in Nigeria, wanting to have a platform where we come together and talk about issues that matter. And we've seen that as much as we run with action, we need to sit down, pause within ourselves and think, what are we doing? How is this helping us? And very recently, I've now sort of been introduced to this space of mental health, eco-anxiety, and what's really, really crucial. What needs to go into us mentally before we can press on to even push and reimagine this new world? What are the steps we need to take? What's the impact of meditation and sitting to pause? Because everything happens so fast in the world that we live in. And for us in Nigeria, it's that double complexity of whether it's corruption, poverty, unemployment, that young people are having to grapple with. So platforms like this, platforms like the one I created with SustyVibes, then give us space to pause and think with other like-minded people, with other young people who see things from your point of view, who are also as apprehensive as you are about the future. And from there, we start to think of steps to take for renewal, for reimagination, and that spiritual or emotional healing can start to take place on its own. For me, it's such a huge privilege to be here. I want to have more and more conversations with everyone on the issues arising, on climate change in particular. And then from here, we take on that very bold step or that very bold action of what we need to do, what we need to think of. And I believe this retreat is going to be amazing. Everyone will leave here really, really renewed. Myself, I'm very expectant. The year has been, so much has happened on different faces, whether we think of racial issues globally, think of COVID-19 and political systems. There's been so much happening. Spaces like this give us opportunity to pause and think, and then just go out back into that world of work and world of activism, renewed and refreshed. Thank you very much, Climate of Emotions, for bringing me here. I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you, Isaac.
No, thank you, Jennifer, for such a wonderful introduction, especially given our theme of newly emerging. We have obviously already got a great lesson from you in terms of starting where you are when you see the space that you're in and taking your stock in making change, regardless of what people may think. We all have an individual responsibility if we so choose. Thank you for sharing your story. Next, I want to introduce Clover Hogan. She's going to share some words with us as we again begin this 3-day treat of the climate of emotions. Clover.
Thank you, Isaac. Hello, everyone. My name is Clover Hogan. I am a 21-year-old climate activist and the founder and executive director of Force of Nature, a youth nonprofit now working with students in 52 countries around the world, supporting them to really step up rather than shut down in the face of the climate crisis. So before I launch in, I would love to provide a little bit of context as to why I'm here and how I landed in this position today. So I grew up in Australia's tropical North Queensland, fishing frogs from the toilet and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. My living room only had about 3 walls. So for me, nature was never an other. It was really the cornerstone of my childhood, which is some reason why it came as such a shock to the system when I started learning about how we were destroying nature and how we were destroying ourselves. So growing up, I was not allowed to watch horror films. So I turned to documentaries instead. And I watched The Cove and An Inconvenient Truth. And I felt incredible despair and shock and frustration. And perhaps most of all, from how good the adults in my life were at pretending that the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, didn't exist. I thought, how have I gone 11 years of my life growing up in pristine nature, not realizing just how much of this is at threat? We didn't talk about the climate crisis at the dinner table. We didn't learn about it at school. We certainly didn't hear about it in the media or from Australian politicians. So I really became interested in why we shut down in the face of big existential challenges like the climate and ecological crisis, like racial injustice and social inequality, to understand the role of mobilizing mindsets for climate action, right? What is it about our psychology that inhibits us from taking action, and what is it that we can do to really mobilize people in collective? So that was my catalyst moment. Skip ahead a few years, and my passion for the intersection of mental well-being and the climate crisis really came from lived experience of experiencing enormous eco-anxiety and grief. So in November of 2019, I found myself spontaneously crying. I would cry on the tube, I would cry in the shower, I would cry in meetings, and I realized that I was going through grief. I was going through enormous sadness. And that's because every time I looked down at my phone, I saw the images rolling in of the fires back home in Australia, of millions and millions of acres of forest, pristine forests going up in flames, of 2 billion animals being incinerated, of friends standing on tin roofs armed with hoses until the smoke and embers clung to their clothes. For the first time, having grown up in a bubble of relative climate privilege, the climate crisis was no longer something I read about in books or articles, but it was the cause of my loss of culture and home and childhood. And I realized at that point that in the 10 years I've been working on the climate crisis, I'd experienced eco-anxiety and I'd experienced all of these emotions, but I thought that they were somehow a weakness. I thought that to be respected and recognized in this space, I had to be the inspiring, empowered, energizing climate activist. And I found myself becoming a caricature of myself to the point where I was trying to achieve external sustainability, but in doing so, I had completely stripped myself of inner sustainability. And I realized at this moment where I was feeling completely unconsolable that I could no longer keep performing these mental gymnastics. And I had to create space both for the grief and sadness and also the optimism and vision of the future that is possible. But it was an important moment because it was also the moment at which I started reaching out to other young people and understanding that I was not alone in my eco-anxiety, but that it was an experience shared by so many, particularly in my generation. Research in 2020 showed that in the UK, over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds were experiencing eco-anxiety. And we found the same on a global scale through our research at Force of Nature, where over 70% of the young people we surveyed said that the climate crisis negatively contributed to their mental health, and over 70% of them felt hopeless in response to the climate crisis. And critically, only 26% of those young people felt that they could make a meaningful contribution to solving climate change. So I'm really excited to be here today because it's critically important that we shed light on what is still largely a silent epidemic of mental health problems exacerbated by the climate crisis, and really talk about how we create space together in collective for some of those more difficult emotions. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Clover. Powerful story. I'm not sure where you think you are on your journey, but I think you've nailed it. Inspiring and informative, what you bring to the table. And I want to thank both Jennifer and Clover in setting such a strong introduction into two individuals who have taken on some of the most huge and costly tasks of our society moving forward. And I want to everybody take a breath to breathe in and out after hearing those stories. It's quite powerful, and let's honor and recognize the space that we're in and our own emotions in hearing these powerful women. So, as a moderator here, I would like to welcome all our panelists. My name is Isaac Carter. First, I would like to make sure that if anyone has not registered for small group co-create sessions or the experiential co-sessions, please do that. This is very important. Our panelists are great. We're going to get to the real heart of the climate of emotion happens in the self-study guide in the small groups. And we want to put that link in the chat for everybody so they can participate. Today's small group co-create sessions are all about our stories and our relationships with the ear and finding empathy. So on that theme, I would like to introduce or have all the panelists introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about you. And I'll ask you in your own words, think about your own story in relationship to the earth and the life here. And what are 3 of your key words? So as the panelists are getting their thoughts together on their 3 key words, we'll take a second, and all the people who are listening, you can also ask and answer that question for yourselves.
That's such a difficult question, so we're all great at talking for hours and hours, but maybe less so at distilling it down to that core. I might volunteer Valentina to go first. You look like you have your thoughts collected.
Like, not really. I am a little bit like confused. I don't know, like I have many words on my mind. I don't know if I should introduce myself before like say my keyword. My name is Valentina Prada. I am a Colombian activist, climate activist, feminist as well, like intersections and everything. I am part of groups like Fridays for Future Bogota, Fridays for Future Colombia. I'm one of the co-founders of Latinas for Climate, which is a platform which talks about gender and climate issues. So yeah, like I'm really happy to be here. I've heard about all of your work, so like I'm really excited to be with you over here. And I think that, well, my keywords, like this is the part I didn't want to get to, because I think that it's really difficult, but I think that most of my activism goes through like empathy, first of all, I think, and understanding what other people are going through. Like, of course, also understanding what I'm going through, because I don't know, like sometimes we, how could I say it? Like, we care so much about what's going over there and we don't look to ourselves. So I think that also self-care, it's one thing that I should add. And the third word, well, I'm not really sure about that. But I think that those 2 are like my, I don't know, like the biggest.
Thank you, Valentina. And if you don't have 3 words, it's okay. It is fine. And I'll jump in real quick and say that my 3 words are mercy, mercy me from the Marvin Gaye song, because we need some more mercy. It's more mercy. And then I have a role in that being me. So if any other panelists would introduce themselves, and you can do it without the 3 words, but if you have them, would appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, hi everyone, and it was so great to hear from Valentina and everyone else that just spoke. And my name is Isaias. I am an environmental educator and creator of QueerBrownVegan, an educational platform that focuses on bringing introductory forms of environmentalism through colorful graphics and illustrations and videos. And so I think for me, those 3 keywords I think about my work is decay, growing, and blooming, because I think that when we are decaying, it's a natural process of something that we are losing within ourselves, and not necessarily in a negative sense, but maybe we are shedding something that we've unlearned throughout this process of our activism work. And so I think that has really been a really fundamental in my own journey as an environmental educator, is that I'm challenging myself to learn new things that I would have not known, or really to think outside through a Western perspective, because that is primarily, I am based in the United States. And I think with growing, this is part of the most ugly process, I would say, because growing is not really a beautiful process, right? You have to confront your own biases, you have to confront other things that you may have not known of. And I think blooming is like a really beautiful stage, because I don't think that we always know when we're blooming. It just sometimes there's those moments in your work that you really feel aligned with in your values. You feel that you are making change in your own self. And so I think those 3 words I've kept very personal in the work I do today and trying to see that outlook in life. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for introducing yourself. Now we know who our panelists are and heard a little bit about them. I want to jump into some questions. If people have questions, there'll also be some questions you can put in the comment section. But so let's start out by thinking through in syncing new ways to thinking about climate. What constrains you and your imagination about what freeze is it?
Sorry, Isaac, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So in seeking new ways of thinking about climate, what constrains your imagination? And common, what freezes it? What limits you?
Good question. I'm happy to share a quick answer. I think the climate crisis is a symptom of othering. So othering nature, like even the fact that we talk about like humans and nature, it kind of like perpetuates a bit of our God complex, where we are removed from our dependence on nature and also our interconnectedness with the environment and our impact on it. But also, you know, when trying to find resolution with people we disagree with, or the fact that we've allowed ourselves to become so distant from frontline communities who are experiencing the direct impacts of the climate crisis and social injustice. For me, that it comes from a place of othering, and often when I find myself really triggered by someone, or particularly climate deniers, which I have one in my family, often it's a projection of the othering that is happening within myself, where I'm disallowing certain emotions from coming to the surface. So for me, the thing that limits my ability to deliver that future or that better world is when I see the world through like divisiveness and polarity, rather than being in a much bigger collective with a bigger purpose.
Thank you, Clover. Anyone else want to add to that question? What constrains your imagination? What freezes it?
If I could just jump in, Isaac, very, very brilliant point, Clover. And I think it's something that cuts through. Each and every one of us feel that sense of ordering that comes. I think for me, it's precedents and history, histories of oppression and histories of injustice that has just been for centuries and that has continued to go on Then when you think of that history and you think of this future, optimist future you're trying to imagine, you struggle with it because it's so ironical to imagine how we've gone through the world, centuries of oppression, centuries of injustice, and then we want to, think of a pathway for climate justice. What makes it different now? So that's really, really key in terms of constraints. Of course, there are ways around it, but it's something that it's that big elephant in the room that you can't wrap your head around because it's always going to be there in your face, even when you're not thinking about the changing climates, even just turning on the news, that oppression and that polarity, like Clover mentioned, would always be in your face. And then it constrains you and limits however way you want to imagine what change could look like. Yeah.
Thank you. Do any other panelists want to jump in before I pose the next question? So the next question is, you've already kind of introduced the concept of our ecology and how it relates to both people and the environment. But I would like to ask each of you to speak to what are the links between climate justice and social justice?
Well, I think that maybe I could start with that. Well, like climate justice and social justice can't be like understand without like intersecting each other. I think that that's something really important that we should take into account because, as a friend says, like constantly, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and there are people that are not equally affected and that are most affected people areas. For example, what will be the term MAPA. I'm not MAPA. Well, I might live in Colombia, but I have many privilege compared to other people here in the country and in the rural areas and territories. So I think that it is important for us to understand that sometimes like government, I don't know, like presidents and everything, big businesses, they like oppress other people, and like for the, I don't know, like extraction and climate like destruction. I don't know if I'm saying it okay, I'm sorry. English is not my first language, but I think that that's like the thing. When we are destroying like our environment, we are also affecting other people that are living over there. So it is important for us to take into account that those are like equally related, and that we cannot talk about like climate, I don't know, like action without acting on social issues.
Thank you, Valentina. Do any other panelists want to jump in to talk about the links between climate justice and social justice?
Yeah, I guess I was going to say too, like, we cannot liberate ourselves from this environmental crisis without our community. And so I think that recognizing that if you've been someone that's been able to opt out of social, racial, or environmental injustices for so long, it's really everyone's duty to take action to understand where you can start. And so I think that in recognizing that historically, Black and Indigenous people of color have been economically suppressed, have been systematically oppressed by a lot of racist policies and institutions, that it is our duty that we recognize that the ones that have been fighting for so long in this environmental movement that have been often been ignored by the media, silenced, or murdered, especially land defenders that have been murdered every year. It is our duty to recognize that we really cannot separate humans from this ecological crisis, as it's an intertwined issue. And so in trying to become better advocates for the planet, I believe that we have unique roles in this movement, and not everyone has to be an activist. I think I realized that at a later year in my life, is that some people become activists, some people become educators, some people are artists, painters, models, photographers, videographers. poets. And so we need different types of people in different roles in this climate movement to ensure that we have an equitable future for many people, not only younger generations, but our future generations, because this is an intergenerational movement. And so I cannot do this without my own community. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, Isaias. Do any other panelists want to share the links between climate justice and social justice from their perspective?
Okay, thank you, Isaac. I mean, just to jump in, Isaias and Valentina have really hit the nail on the head on this sort of explanation. When I think of climate change, I think everything changed really. So it's, you know, social, it's everything, finances. This affects us in multitude of ways, basically. And then the injustice for me and how it relates to society is that when you think of the roots of climate change, we're looking at extractivist, you know, patriarchal and really racist and oppressive systems that brought about social injustice in the first place, that's now leading to the climate injustice that we see. And it's that those power struggles that would always be at play in whatever conversations that we have. You can't then take away climate change conversations away from that reality, because this is where we are, this is the context that we are. So thinking around climate change, everything change, then social injustice definitely comes to play. Social injustice, really, it's now how when we say that climate change impacts us directly, it's that social injustice we think of, because places where they are vulnerable, you ask, why are they vulnerable? What systems, you know, made them vulnerable to issues of climate change? Why are other places, you know, more resilient? What structures are in place? Then you see the injustice at play. Then you see, you know, what priorities come to play, how we prioritize our society, and why more people have power than others. And so you can't really take away the social away from the climate. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Powerful words that each of you have shared. And you all come from a different perspective, but in many ways are definitely aligned. And the next question is, like, how have you become more aware of your own positionality as you've tried to engage these different systems of oppression and moving obviously toward liberation? Like, what has your journey been like as you've understood yourself in the context of your work, but also in relationship to other social issues?
I'd love to build off what Jennifer was just saying, because I think exactly as you said, this is also reflected in the language that we use about the climate crisis, and recognizing that the next 10 years is a particularly critical window for change, as the science is telling us. Still, we talk about the climate crisis as if it's this kind of far off impending threat, which completely kind of sweeps over the fact that there are frontline communities who are already living through the impacts of the climate crisis, whether that is from, you know, locust swarms in East Africa, which are destroying food crops, or, you know, children in the Maldives losing their homes to rising sea levels already, or, you know, families in Jakarta. 100,000 people were displaced in Jakarta in 2019 from mass flooding, unlike anything that they'd seen in recorded history. So I think we have to make sure that the climate crisis is not talked about through the lens of polar bears or solar panels, because this is an issue of delivering fair and equitable societies. And we will not deliver climate solutions without centering people who are already living those impacts and ensuring that people who have historically been left out of those decision-making spaces are right there at the decision-making table, and not in the context of some white savior colonialism, which is like, we're going to come in, try and fix the day, and actually leave you way worse than you were previously. But we are going to support the people who are already experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis in the global south. And a large part of that is to do with reparations. And unfortunately, the pandemic, I think a lot of us, to Josh's point in the comments, like, oh, this is going to be the great equalizer. Everyone's in the same boat, but that could not be further from reality. Like, there are a number of countries and communities that are not projected to get vaccines until 2030 because of the inequality with distribution. And unfortunately, with the climate crisis, largely the global south is already living through this reality. So it is critically important that people in existing positions of power ensure that those who haven't been in those decision-making spaces have that seat at the table.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Obviously, having a seat at the table helps. And then who makes that table is the question sometimes, and who's invited to it, and what resources and tools that we have when you get there. Did any of you other panelists have any other thoughts to share to talk about your own positionality and awareness and how you engage in systems of oppression and toward liberation?
Yeah, I think for me, I believe that environmental education should be a human right. However, I think many people do not agree with that. And so I think for me, my role as an educator was a bit complex because I grew up experiencing environmental injustices, but then after entering academia and leaving that university, it almost seems as if I was also contributing to this realm of saviorism. And so for me, I realized that through social media, I was able to really create these introductory forms of education. So people I'm not their teacher, so they can build their own framework off of those resources. And so I think there needs to be a lot of redistribution of power, resources, and wealth. However, I think as like my role as an educator, it's been a little bit difficult trying to work with institutions to implement more just conversations that talk about race, class, and gender, only because it's sometimes seen as controversial in some states. And so I think for me, being an educator that's not traditionally through academics, but online, I've seen the influx of not just younger students asking me questions, but also older parents trying to be better prepared to have conversations with their children of how to live eco-friendly, how to talk about the climate crisis, how do you talk about natural disasters when they strike your own community. And so something that I believe that is the first step for people to create that from individual change to local change, then system change, is education. And so I think here in the West, it costs $0 fundamentally to advocate for human rights. And knowing the privileges that we have here in the West that are able to advocate for human rights is super important, because how do we look into our own positionality compared to different countries where it may not be able to conversate about these topics or to really go into these issues. And so positioning ourselves in this movement is really important through education, because I think that's what really exposes people to find their own unique role. But that's one of the first steps, I would say.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question I want to ask, a little off script, but as the intergenerational nature of this has been spoken about a little bit, I would love and invite you all to comment on the perspective of someone who may be slightly older than you, just slightly. When we live in a world, and many social justice advocates speaking in the West in very urban areas, when sometimes they don't necessarily have trees immediately around them, or grass, or understand the ecology outside of their own particular situation that may be dealing with violence, police brutality, poor educational standards, etc., along with environmental concerns like we saw in Detroit with water. Like, how do you make that connection to people who live in urban places that don't often think about the environment, and also people who are doing great advocacy work that are just doing it without necessarily the lens of the ecology?
Could you please repeat like the question? Like, I would like to answer, but I think that I want to ensure that I got it like correctly.
How do you help people who fight for justice in urban areas who may not necessarily see environmental justice as a primary concern, make the connection to the work that has happened globally with the environment, especially given the generations of different movements that have taken a priority over time, like in the United States, civil rights, etc., women's rights, those different types of advocacy have not always been inclusive or had a ecological lens. How would you help to bridge that?
Oh, okay. Like, I think that I will relate it more to like the Colombian context. I would like to say that, well, like we've lived in a civil war for like 50 years. Like right now it's like, I don't know, like sort of solved, but not really because, well, we keep living in a really violent country. But I think that that's how we make the connection, you know, like all these, I don't know, like fights for territory and the exploitation of the environment, it ends affecting people that migrate to cities, for example. And I think that that's like a first way in which we can explain to people how these are all connected. You know, like when you start, I don't know, exploiting the environment, well, people living there are being affected by that. And women, like, I don't know, primarily. And so I think that what I do, well, when I want to explain myself on social justice and climate justice, is to take like examples, you know, like for example, there are, I don't know, zones over here that are being damaged, and what happens to the people that live there, and like how are they affected, how their water, for example, is being contaminated. And I think that that's an like a good example for people to make those connections. Have made that with my family, for example, like they didn't make like the connections between climate and social issues. So what I did was like to take these examples from reality and like, I don't know, try to bring them into words that they can understand as well, because, well, I'm not also like a scientist or anything. I actually study literature, so like I can explain myself better with words or writing. So what I do is exactly that, like take those, I don't know, like stories that can be written, for example, in a really, I don't know, like scientific language, and bring them to our context and how we talk to that, and being also patient. I think that that's also really important, because making those connections for me also like wasn't easy. So I have to understand how, like, the position of the other person, and I think that that understanding can like help to, like, I don't know, bring people consciousness about what's going on.
Thank you very much. Sharing stories and helping you see another person's point of view is definitely an approach. Anyone else want to comment on the question posed?
Sure, Isaac. As an add-on to that, and that was really a very good way of putting it, Valentina. I think what comes across to me a lot of times when I want to talk about climate action or climate activism to other activists or people living in the urban spaces is that what we see with climate activism is still the same power analysis and power structures that come to play in other forms of activism. And you can't, it then becomes easy to explain, because we know what side we're on, what we really want, you know, what's most critical, people and the planet. And then we see that we're literally speaking the same language. And for us in Nigeria, we found ourselves partnering with organizations working solely on women's rights and gender-based violence. We found ourselves working with organizations looking at displacement of people, because we're all speaking the same language. Is that idea of power, is that idea of, you know, wanting, putting capitalism or money before people. And then we see that we're able to speak the same language. And then secondly, just like Valentina explained, movies and popular culture. I really like what Isaias does on social media, you know, with the graphics and all of that. Those platforms and those ways sort of make the conversation a bit less geeky and scientific, to show that this is, you know, this is everyday problem. This is something we can all relate to. This is something that affects us in one way or the other. And thirdly, for me, it's now becoming very obvious to talk about climate activism to everyone. We're seeing it every day. It's sort of encroaching on us in the news. Every day there's something that reminds you that this is something critical. For us in Nigeria, it's as little as insecurity, food security, because when you think of the prices of food and then you trace it back to the fact that our weather has been changing, and then there's this link with climate change, it then becomes on people's mind that we have a problem. We're not addressing it as it should be, but there's definitely a problem, and this is what these climate activists have been speaking about for many years. But that top of mind awareness is now coming up a lot because the problems they're so close to home and you can literally feel them every day. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing. I want to acknowledge that in the comment section, there is a comment made by Hannah Garrison about food being a way to connect to climate change, and kind of goes with what you just shared with us regarding where our food comes from, how it gets to our tables, and how it is distributed. Is a good lesson for all of us to take and keep in mind as we think about how we make a connections between all of these movements for justice. I want to transition a little bit and ask you all, in terms of thinking through your own thoughts and emotions regarding climate justice and social justice, what is the role that empathy plays in your work for intersectional environmentalism?
Empathy is huge. I feel like this is the question that I always ask my students, is like, if you could solve any one problem in the world today, what would it be? And I think easily the most common answer is like lack of empathy. It's so important because, as we were touching on earlier, it's not just about extending empathy to others, of course, extending empathy to yourself as well. And particularly on the theme of today, dealing with difficult emotions in response to the climate crisis, it takes a lot of empathy to not feel, shame around some of those difficult emotions. I know a lot of, activists experience incredible burnout. Like, I experienced terrible burnout last week, and that is ultimately driven, at least from me, by a feeling of not doing enough, of not acting quickly enough. And I feel like so much of our sense of self-worth and feeling valid comes from things that are ultimately outside of our control, right? Like, a lot of climate activists take personal responsibility for solving the climate crisis. So extending personal empathy is really critically important. And I think that is also what is going to help us to experience a more global sense of empathy in connecting to where our food comes from, for example, where it ends up, who grew it, how it got there, not just from the supermarket, but right in front of you, and will allow us to better appreciate the intersectionality of each of these challenges. And I think often we can feel super overwhelmed by the climate crisis because it feels so complex. But in fact, the one thing that I would reiterate that I think is most important to learn about is the intersectionality, because then you can begin to appreciate that none of these problems exist in silos, from prison reform to food waste to fast fashion. They're all incredibly interlinked. And the more we can appreciate how connected we are to the things that we use, but also people from every corner of the world, I think empathy is a really powerful way of achieving that.
Thank you very much, Clover. Any other panelists like to talk about the role of empathy in their work?
Well, I think that, like, as Clover was saying as well, like, many of the problems we have had, like, globally in history are because of the lack of empathy, I believe. Sometimes we don't want to understand, or people don't want to understand the other person's, like, situation, or what they're going through, or what are their limits, what they can do, and that, like, causes many trouble. So I think that it is really important that we like sit down and understand what the other person is going through. Because also, like, when acting in the climate crisis, we maybe cannot do the same amount of work. For example, maybe some people, I don't know, like, are more unstable in that way. Like, I don't know, like, they can get tired, or, well, not tired like in a bad way, but in a mental health way. So, like, you cannot be as involved as other people would be. And sometimes, like, we also force ourselves into keep acting and acting, because we think that we are not going to be valued for what we do. But also understanding, I don't know, like, affected people's situation. For example, what they're going through, once again, in territories or rural areas. And that we should, like, break those boundaries that are between cities and like the rural areas, once again. And I think that that can help us to achieve, like, climate action that works on intersectionality.
Thank you. Anyone else before we move along? Well, thank you very much for the sharing the power of empathy in your work. So we have about 10 more minutes, about 8 more minutes, I guess, and we're getting close to wrapping up here. Question I want to pose is to all the panelists, and hopefully we can get all the responses from each of you. In a few words, what is this conversation inspiring or awakening in you? So how is this conversation inspiring or awakening within you?
I think for me, it allows me to really materialize my own work and thoughts, and to feel validated the fact that we all share these different types of emotions, that we should be acknowledging our anger, our grief, our trauma, our sadness, our love for the earth, because realistically, that's what makes us beings in this planet. And so I think that with materialization, it allows us to really further not reimagine, but to create that work that we wanted to do. So that's all I wanted to share.
Thank you, Isaias. Any of our other panelists? Well, it's overwhelming, the response.
Yeah, indeed it is, Isaac. Indeed it is. I guess, I mean, there's several thoughts running through my mind just listening to everyone. It's been such a brilliant conversation. And that thread that we all share something in common, no matter where we are in the world, we're all thinking about these issues in the same way. But for me, in terms of a take home, it's that conversation, and I'm sure Clover agrees with me, that eco-anxiety and these emotions that we feel are super, super important. And it might just be what leads us to, this new frontier, having spaces like this where we acknowledge these emotions, and say it's okay, and there's no shame and no guilt. And from these spaces, we then think of places where we've missed out. Something that has come out now is that idea of empathy. People can then go home and, look at their work, their activism, or the lack of it, and see where empathy can play out. So spaces like this where we express ourselves, talk about our emotions in relation to climate change, I dare say it gives us bold ideas for how we can press on, how we can do better. There's that idea of wanting to rest, renew, and then even listening to the other person to say, you're not alone. This is something we're all doing together. We're all facing at the same time. So it's good to have such reflective spaces. That's why I think, yeah.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
There's a really beautiful story that I was told while attending a virtual Buddhist retreat, which was really cool, on the theme of activism, which kind of reflected on how alienating it can feel often. We often talk about these kind of like aha moments or these catalysts or wake up calls where suddenly you look around and you're like, oh, wow, something's really wrong here. Like something's broken about the way that we're living or about the system that I'm in, or even, you know, checking your own privilege, like realizing that you've benefited from all of these systems your entire life. Yeah, we often forget to talk about like what happens after that point. And I think naturally that pain and anger and anxiety can draw us to connect with other people who are on that same path. And yet at the same time, it can be incredibly alienating. And I know that I felt that way before finding, you know, this community of incredible change makers on the front lines doing the work day in, day out. And this Buddhist story says that, you know, it's as if we're, you know, paddling down a river and there are lots of people around us and we're all in our canoes. And yet suddenly we realize, you know, the fog kind of clears and we see that we're hurtling toward this waterfall, this cliff. And suddenly you look around and you start kind of like, you know, pulling the alarm and you start turning around and paddling in the opposite direction. And everyone, you know, is still kind of stuck in this fog and they don't see the edge of that cliff. And so they look at you as if you're kind of crazy as you're paddling madly against the stream. And I think for so many people experiencing eco-anxiety, experiencing these difficult emotions, it can feel exactly like that, where you're paddling upstream. Not only is it hard work, but people are looking at you as if you're insane. And so I think it's really, really important to connect with like-minded individuals who are on that same journey. And for me, that's how I feel connecting with each of you and connecting with this awesome audience as well that has been super engaged, is you feel like, okay, wow, I found my tribe. So thank you all.
Thank you, Clover. Excuse me. Thank you for sharing your story, as well as sharing the story of the Buddhist parable to help us think about how we are showing up in the spaces and how we, as people who want to enact and make change, sometimes need that think about ourselves as part of a collective and not just alone. Anyone else want to jump in and share what's inspiring and awakening in them from this conversation?
I would like to say something. Well, I think that it was great for me, I don't know, to have like this conversation in a context that's not like private. I don't know, like sometimes I have these kind of chats with friends or family even, but most of the times with friends. But like, I don't know, like creating a panel and like all these activities like that connect climate and emotions. I think that it is really important because it's something that has to come into discussion when speaking about climate crisis. Because, well, like as Clover was saying when we started, we are also nature. We are part of this like big thing. It's not like we are somewhere and nature is other in the other way. Like we are all connected, and I think that it is really important that we understand that. Well, as I said, we are nature as well, and that I don't know, like connecting ourselves with nature and together can help us like achieve all those changes that we want to make.
Thank you. We are nature. Very good thought to think about as we transition. So if the panelists don't have any words that want to share, we're almost at time. So people should be wrapping up and thinking about their next session they're going to be in. So I want to give a reminder that if you signed up for small group sessions and that you received the Climate Emotion Self-Study Workbook so that you can continue this restorative work of this retreat, I want to say thank you to the panelists. You people of nature are a force of nature, and it was really inspiring to hear your stories and for you to share your work and your experience. I want to personally say, as someone who's been doing some work for a greater part of almost 30 years, not that much older, it is inspiring to continue to see the work that's coming from young people, because that's how the world has changed. And I deeply appreciate you all's spirit and energy that you're putting out in the world so we can have a world to enjoy. So I want to personally thank you. And with everybody has been listening, please, thank you for being here and watching. Please share the video and join sessions later on today.
I want to thank you all, Isaac and panelists. I'm Josh Friedman, the CEO of 6 Seconds, and on behalf of the organizing committee, which this Climate of Emotions this year was designed primarily by people who are under 25, and we are hoping that in this work we can connect with one another, as you've talked about today, across generations, across the world. And perhaps the biggest bridge to cross is this one, this 18-inch bridge. If I let myself feel what you were talking about today, it's hard for me to talk because I will cry too much. You think about what it really means to grapple with the complexity that you've been talking about, to grapple with the reality of climate collapse and how that's affecting people in the world today, and the emotional impact on all of us, and how that's magnified and connected with the social crises that we face around injustices. We have so much work to do, and it can be completely overwhelming. And yet the common ground is us. And we have this within ourselves. So I'm very grateful to Isaac and the panelists for your sharing today, and for all of you participating. I want to make sure that everyone who's here knows that we have another panel in 12 hours, well, 11 hours from now. And then tomorrow we have we have another panel this afternoon. And then we have these incredibly beautiful small group sessions where you're going to get to work with like-hearted people to connect and share and explore these questions. The self-study guide is an unbelievable resource to help you do this inner work. And so if you sign up for any of the sessions or just sign up for the keynote panels, you'll get the link to the self-study guide, and it's all free. We do have a request that if you are able to, please donate and support the work that we're doing here. And this work that we're doing here continues all year into the World Children's Day Project in partnership with UNICEF World Children's Day. And so if you are in a position to contribute, please do that and support the work that we're doing here in Climate of Emotions and how it's going to continue throughout the year. We have a deep commitment to keep doing this work with you and to keep connecting, because we are nature, because this work starts on the inside, because this work must be done. So thank you for being here and for all of your work increasing emotional intelligence in the world. And I look forward to seeing you on one of our next panels soon. Have a beautiful day as we lead up to Earth Day, and thank you for being here.